This is the Module 4, Capacity Management. We're covering Chapter 5 in the textbook, and I'm Professor Rao. So, capacity management, let's kind of give you a general idea of what it's about. Capacity management is going to occur at all levels of the planning process. It's directly related to that priority plan, and the level of detail and the time spans will be similar to the related priority plan. So, capacity planning is concerned about how do you take that priority plan and translate it into hours of capacity in manufacturing so you can make those items that are listed in the priority plan with methods of making the capacity available. So, capacity available is really going to depend on the number of workers you have, the number of machines, the utilization, and efficiency. So, there is a couple of terms we need to clarify that can be that are used interchangeably, but there is a distinction. So in manufacturing, when we talk about capacity, we're talking about the maximum amount of production a facility can produce within a given time frame. So essentially, capacity is representing the potential output. Now, the capacity is not the same thing as load. When we talk about load, load is going to signify the actual amount of work that's assigned to that facility at a specific time. So essentially, it's the current demand that's placed on its capacity. So another way to say that would be that capacity is the potential to produce, whereas load is the current amount that's being produced. So a couple of key points here, just to reiterate, is that capacity represents the maximum possible production volume that's going to be based on what available resources you have, the availability of your machines, the workers, also the materials. So you have to treat capacity like it's this theoretical limit, assuming that all your conditions are optimal. Now, you can also, capacity can be calculated by considering factors like machine run time, labor availability, and even production rates. Now, load on the other side is representing the actual amount of work that's currently being assigned to that production facility. So, load is measured by the number of units scheduled to be produced within a specific time. So, load can be less than the available capacity if there is not enough demand. Load can also exceed the capacity, which could lead to some bottlenecks. So maybe let's kind of clarify it with an example. So let's say that we've got a factory production line and it has the capacity to produce 1,000 widgets per day based on the number of machines and the workforce that you have. Now, are we going to actually be able to produce 1,000 widgets per day? No, there can be some things that will mess it up. Now, load would be more representative. So instead of 1,000, say that despite all the constraints and things that issues that took place, load that for that day, we were only able to produce 800 widgets today. So then the load for the factory is going to be 800 widgets. And of course, which is the 800 widgets is going to be way less than the total capacity, which I mentioned to be 1,000 widgets per day. So when you're doing the working out problems, keep these two definitions separated and make sure you read the problems carefully as you're working through them. Now, a couple of other key points in terms of managing load versus capacity is good. So you have to think about production planning. If you understand the difference between capacity and load, then manufacturers can effectively plan production schedules so they can optimize that resource utilization and avoid overloading the machine or overworking your staff. The second reason why it's important to know that distinction is to be able to identify bottlenecks. Monitoring the load against the capacity is going to help you identify any bottlenecks in the production process where the demand is exceeding what is the available production capability. The third reason why it's important to make this distinction is cost control. If you have efficient capacity management, you'll be able to avoid some unnecessary production costs that are associated with overstaffing or just having a bunch of extra machines that are idle and not doing anything. Okay, so now that you understand the difference between capacity and load, let's talk a little bit about capacity planning now. So, when we're talking about capacity planning, we're assessing how much capacity the organization currently has. We're also predicting how much capacity will be needed in the future. If we're steadily growing the number of sales that are occurring, then obviously we're going to have to manage for or plan for those things in the future. So planning in the sense of making sure we have enough people, we have enough machines that are available when we do surpass, the forecast. So let's talk about so take that for example. Say we have a bakery, for example. And so understanding how many pies can be made and baked in a given day using the existing number of baking ovens and staff, that would be your capacity. So understanding that, that this is how many number of pies you have given the number of equipment and staff is going to allow the bakery to plan, how many pies can they sell and what they can charge for them, and also how many apples, etc., all the resources, the raw materials that they need to plan for to make sure that they do sell the maximum to maximize their profits. All right. Now, the next thing is that I want to differentiate between capacity management and capacity planning. So, both terms are related to resource allocation. And this is where students kind of get that mixed up. And so, capacity management is referring to the ongoing process of actively managing the current resources to meet what the existing demand is. Whereas when we're referring to capacity planning, we're focusing on strategically forecasting the future demand and then determining, what kind of resources do we need to meet this expected future demand? Essentially, with capacity planning, we're looking ahead to prepare for potential needs. Capacity management, we're looking at the current resource utilization. We're aiming to optimize resource allocation based on the immediate demands. So that also involves tracking performance and making adjustments as we need it. Whereas capacity planning, we're analyzing the future demand trends and determining what are the required resources based on that anticipated demand. So capacity planning is more of a strategic approach to resource allocation in the future. So, say you're a project manager and you're monitoring the current workload of a team. And so, if you're monitoring the current workload of that team, you're ensuring that no one is overloaded and you're adjusting the assignments accordingly. So, this would be an example of capacity management. But say that you're a company and you're analyzing market trends to predict the future customer demand, and then you're planning to hire additional staff or maybe even acquire some necessary equipment to handle that increased workload. Since we're referencing future trends, then that's capacity planning at hand. Now, capacity planning and control are also used, interchangeably at times. So let's distinguish these two terms. So, as I said before, capacity planning is all about focusing proactively to anticipate that future demand and then adjusting the resource levels to meet it. While as capacity control is where you're actively managing current resource utilization so that you can ensure efficient operations based on that real time demand fluctuation. So, in a nutshell, capacity planning is about preparing for the future. Capacity control is about, managing the present moment. So, give you some key points. If we're talking about long-term focus, if you're looking at future demand trends to determine necessary resource levels over a longer time horizon, that's capacity planning. If you're relying on forecasting future demand to make strategic decisions about resource planning, you're doing capacity planning. So if you're trying to ensure that there's sufficient capacity available to meet anticipated future needs, you're doing capacity planning. Now, if you're looking at short-term focus and you're monitoring what the current resource utilization is so you can optimize efficiency in the immediate term, that's capacity control. If you're using a reactive approach where you're responding to fluctuations just by resource adjusting the resource allocation on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis, there you're doing capacity control. So let me leave you with an example, and then we'll wrap up uh, this lecture. So, for capacity planning, an example of that would be a manufacturing company that's analyzing projected sales growth over the next year. And you're deciding whether you should invest in new machinery to meet that anticipated production demands. Capacity control, this say that the same company is monitoring production output on a daily basis and they're adjusting staff levels to accommodate for sudden changes in order volume on a daily basis. That's capacity control. All right. So now that you've gotten these definitions kind of straightened out, I think it'll make reading the chapter a little bit much easier. And so so now we need to focus on capacity requirements planning. And so it's good to know what are the inputs and outputs for, materials resource planning, requirements planning. So the key things that you should notice from here is that the outputs are going to be open orders, you're going to have routing, you're going to have materials requirements plans and work center. So the primary input to capacity requirements planning is going to be, planned order releases. Planned order releases essentially refers to what's the anticipated production orders that are scheduled to be released in a specific time frame. And that's important because that's going to provide you the data that you need to calculate the required capacity at each of the work centers within a single production process. Now, other key inputs to capacity requirements planning would be what we call routing files. What are routing files? They're detailed information about the manufacturing process, everything from the sequence of operations and the work centers involved for each product. Then the second input would be the work center capacities. So work center capacity is all about what's the available production capacity at each work center, including the machine time and the labor availability. And so lead times is also important input. You need to know lead time because that's the time required to complete each operation within a production process. And then time standards. You should know what the industry standard is to produce that particular product, the estimated time. And so that way you know if there's any malfunctions within your factory equipment. Now, the bill of materials, this is going to give you the list of all the components that you require to produce that finished product. And you need to reference the bill of materials to calculate the material needs for each planned order. So, in a nutshell, what the key point to remember is that planned order releases is the most critical input because it directly translates into the workload for each of the work centers. Okay, so that wraps up this chapter here. So make sure you read chapter 5. And if you have questions, I'm around. Thank you for joining me.